Okay, so we were talking about faith from the Arnett book, and I think we've said all we need to say about that. College is an important part, and work. Those are kind of things that we don't need to talk a lot about. We've talked already a lot about college. Work with emerging adulthood. Well, let me back up a little bit. I guess the one thing that we would say about college that's important is that college, like everything else in emerging adulthood, is delayed. Uh, it's more and more common for someone now to take a longer time going through college. It's more and more common that someone is still finishing a bachelor's degree or even an associate's degree when they're 25 or 26 because of economy or whatever. They've decided to go really slowly. Um, it's just delayed. It's getting more and more likely that an 18-year-old doesn't decide to just go full time right into college. Uh, on the other hand, we also see work being something that's still kind of delayed because you may go to college for 4 years and then get out of college and say, well, I don't know what I want to do with myself. And it doesn't have anything to do with how smart you are or how good you are. I've known excellent students and people that were very committed to learning and to growing and to education that graduate from college, and then because they still don't know exactly what they want to do, they kind of end up doing nothing, or they end up doing two or three things here and there, and maybe spend 3 or 4 or 5 years kind of trying to find their spot in the world of work. Sometimes people go to grad school because they don't know what they want to do. And they think, well, I might as well get a graduate degree. It'll take me a couple of years. That'll give me a chance to figure out what I want to do. That's not an unhealthy thing. But it is kind of a new generational phenomenon. And so it is something that we're going to have to kind of figure out how to deal with as we work with young adults in the future. The last thing here that I think Arnett mentions that I've always appreciated is James Marsh's kind of idea of identity and how that happens in adolescence, and consequently how it affects young adulthood. Um, Marcia said that when we're looking for identity as teenagers, and if we extend adolescence through college, that's we'll include that here. Is that first of all, there's the notion of an identity moratorium. A moratorium is kind of drawing a line and saying we're not going to do something. A moratorium on taxes means no taxes. Well, an identity moratorium means I'm not going to choose an identity because I don't have to choose an identity, and therefore I will limit that. That's one of the things that's possible to happen in adolescence, and even in college-aged people, is this notion that I don't have to choose, so I'm not going to choose. I'm not going to decide who I am. We may not do that consciously, but sometimes we may do it kind of unconsciously, so that we just delay or refuse to develop identity. Another thing that might happen that's kind of the opposite end of that is identity foreclosure, which is what happens when I'm 15 and I say, I'm going to be an oncologist, and that's it. And so from that point on, I'm the kid who's going to be an oncologist, and then look for schools that can get me into medical school, and then I go to medical school, and that's what I do. Sometimes that works out perfectly. Sometimes somebody's called to the ministry when they're 13 and they're at youth camp, and that's the focus for the rest of their life, and it works out beautifully. The problem is that if we do that kind of identity foreclosure, kind of saying, I've got it, I've nailed it, this is it, very often that doesn't work out that way. And when it doesn't, it can be discouraging, it can be frightening, it can be something where we feel like we failed. Sometimes it can be a thing where we wonder, what was God doing with me, just messing with me, making me feel like I was called to the ministry and now I'm not at all, and all kinds of stuff like that. In my intro classes, and when I'm working with freshmen, whenever I hear, I'll ask them, why are you here? Why are you going to college? And inevitably at Hardin Simmons, you have a group of people who'll say, well, I'm called to the ministry. And I always say, what does that mean? And sometimes they have good answers. The vast majority of the time, they don't have any idea. They say, well, God's calling me to full-time Christian ministry. And I say, well, how do you know that? What does that mean? Aren't we all called to full-time Christian? And I'll mess with them a little bit just to try to get them to kind of think about what does it mean to say I'm called? Because if you've been a part of that world, particularly that American evangelical world, you know that we get really caught up in language, and sometimes we'll say, I've been called to ministry, and that kind of gives us this cool feeling or this sense of elevated status or something like that. And the truth is, sometimes we absolutely are, and sometimes we're absolutely not. And so I think that notion of identity foreclosure, feeling like this is what I'm supposed to do, even when I'm 16 or 17, we may be way off course. And so I think that has some problems associated with it. The third thing there is identity diffusion, which is this notion of just going everywhere and anywhere. I'm going to be a cowboy one week, and the next week I'm a skater, and the next week I'm a rock star, and the next week I'm a cool athlete kid, and the next week I'm a band nerd, and then on and on and on. And we just don't know anything about anything having to do with identity, and so we kind of just blow with the wind, follow our peers, whoever they happen to be this week. That's not a bad thing. I think that's kind of healthy, actually, for adolescents. I think that's how we tend to find out what we want to be. And I think that some of us do that all of our lives. And I don't think it's terribly unhealthy. I think it's okay to kind of explore different things. There's some of us who have a little bit more of a multifaceted identity. Erickson said particularly that people of faith were kind of continually adolescing, continually trying to establish identity. And I don't think that's a horrible idea. I think that it can become problematic, but not necessarily. And then there's the notion of identity achievement, which, as we've said, may not happen until young adulthood, and then may not happen in young adulthood. We may struggle and struggle and struggle with who we are, and we may not get a grip on that until we're quite a bit older than adolescents. Last thing we want to talk about here, it comes leaving Arnett for a minute and moving to James Fowler. This is from Fowler's book, Becoming Adult, Becoming Christian, which I'm not having you read this year, but is a decent book. James Fowler is kind of the preeminent faith development guy. Some of you probably know him, some of you may not. One of the things that Fowler says that's happened over time is that we've moved in young adulthood and faith from what he called an ideological teepee to kind of a protean change. And I'll explain that for a minute. He uses the idea of teepee because he says when you build a teepee, you have this set of poles that you carry with you, and you put up, and you set them up in a particular way so that they all meet at the middle at the top, and then you lash them together, fit them together at the top. You put a cover on it, and then you go in there, and that's how you live. That insulates you from the world. It protects you, and you kind of take that with you wherever you go. But it's always set up the same way, and it always does the same thing. And Fowler says for years and years and years we've kind of built these ideological teepees that's what we've lived in forever. Well, he says lately young adulthood has been more like a protean change based on the notion of Proteus, who was a shapeshifter who would show up at one point as a lion, and then the next time he'd be a lizard, and then he'd be a bear, and then he'd be an elephant, and was rarely presented himself as exactly who he was, usually presented himself in some different form. He was a shapeshifter. And so Fowler says that this notion, that this thing that's happening to young adults and faith now, You can see there at the bottom, young adulthood for Fowler is when we're supposed to develop what he called individuative reflective faith, meaning that it becomes ours. It's not group faith anymore. It becomes individuative, and it's reflective. It's not a faith that we just accept. It's a faith that we think about a lot. So as young adults, our goal is to develop a faith that's mine, that I have examined and I have accepted for myself, not because of youth group, not because of family, not because of pastors, but I have thought it through and I've decided this is my faith. Well, Fowler says that even in that process, there seems to be more Proteus than TP, more shape-shifting and changing and moving, as opposed to 50 years ago when we would build that ideological teepee when we were adolescents, and we would tend to hold on to it until we died. And Fowler says that's not happening to us anymore. One reason is what he calls psychohistorical, excuse me, my chair makes awful squeaks, psychohistorical relocations, which is that we just, this is a little more complicated than it sounds, basically means that we're more mobile. We move. We go from place to place, which gives us a different kind of experience than we had 50 years ago. 50 years ago, if I grew up on a farm, I would very often stay on the farm and work on the farm. If my dad worked in a factory, I would very often follow in his footsteps and work in that same factory. We don't do that so much anymore. We move ourselves around, and that's changed significantly over the last 5 or 6 decades. We also are flooded with imagery and possibilities. So that movement out of the teepee is also just incredibly impacted by the internet. The idea that I can see things and read things and talk to people and blog with people that I would have never been able to do even 20 years ago has changed us so that we're not so much building a house in adolescence and young adulthood and then living in it. We are trying to constantly figure out what we want to look like and what we want to be. And that's a big change, not only in identity and jobs and college and all those things, but also in the area of faith. Those of you who are interested in that, if you haven't read Fowler, then you should read Fowler's books. Becoming Adult, Becoming Christian is not his most popular book is called Stages of Faith, and it's based on his research where he identified faith stages. But Becoming Adult, Becoming Christian is a good look at adult faith development. So I would encourage you to read Fowler if you're interested in that at all. So that wraps up what we're doing about young adulthood. Next week we will talk about marriage and all things related to marriage.